I do know this, that some people are inclined to not want to believe that Paul was physically sick and that he prayed and wasn't healed. Now that comes from their hermeneutic, which says, it's actually a triumphalist hermeneutic, right? So people who hold these views that say, hey, if you are sick or and you pray to be healed and you're not healed, it must be because there's something wrong with you. You didn't pray well enough, you didn't have enough faith, or you have some sin in your life. And so they have to make sense of this. Well, how can the Apostle Paul have prayed 3 times for a physical infirmity to have been removed and God said no? Well, they say, well, then it must not have been physical.
Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us once again this week. And I'm here with Pastor Cady, the pastor of Whitefields Community Church here in Longmont, Colorado. And we are in our series, Strength and Weakness, looking at Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. We're getting to near one chapter away, and we're almost done with this book, and I hope you've enjoyed the journey with us. If you've missed any of that journey, any of the studies, you missed this past Sunday, just head over to whitefieldschurch.com, and you can download it there. And, of course, any of your favorite podcast platforms, YouTube, Facebook. And, of course, if you would, please, smash that like button, subscribe, leave a review, rate and review, and all those kind of fun things. And, just kind of any interaction that we have with the content really just kind of boosts us in the algorithm. And when people are asking questions about their weaknesses, about their trials, the things they're going through, like we've been looking at here in 2 Corinthians, that we can provide them with Christ-centered and gospel-centered answers to their questions. So this week we found ourselves in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, looking at the first 10 verses, and the title of the study was God's Strength in Our Weakness. And what we wanted to look at today was just this thought that came to my mind was like, as we were, Paul, especially last week, Paul's like describing all these things that he's going through and just listing off all this stuff, like we joked about last week, if you're around Paul, there was a high likelihood, there was a high percentage you're going to get caught in a riot, you're going to be shipwrecked, you're going to be stoned, or any of one of these things, or you're going to be beaten with rods or whipped or whatever it was, because, Paul just kind of seemed to be a magnet for that kind of stuff. But what it reminded me of a little bit back, I thought back, was going back to Acts chapter 9, when Paul first gets saved, and the Ananias goes to visit him in that famous passage, and the Lord had spoken to Ananias in a vision, and he was kind of trepidatious about going to visit Paul, but the Lord told Ananias, he tells him there in verse 16, "For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake." And then before that he says, "For he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel." But I just thought about that. I will show him how many things he must suffer for my sake. So here we are in 2 Corinthians. Is probably, we're about 14 years, because of kind of almost dates. Paul dates himself there in the beginning of the chapter by saying, "Hey, I was caught up into the heaven." Yeah. So we're 14 years later.
At least 14, probably more. Probably more like 20.
20 years, So here we are, and Paul is suffering for the Lord's name. So we just kind of fleshed that thought out, like Paul knew what was going to happen to him, or kind of had an inkling.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that he knew that he was going to suffer. He was told right up front, which is kind of nice, right? It wasn't a surprise.
Or is it?
Well, for him, it seems like, that was told to him at the beginning. Yeah. This is what's going to happen. God's going to use you in great ways, and yet you're also going to suffer a lot. And Paul really has if you will, a theology of suffering that's fleshed out in many of his letters. He talks about it. He's clearly not ashamed of it. He talks about that here in this letter. But in other letters, like I just think about what he says in chapter 3 of Philippians, where he's talking about how all the things that were to his benefit, if you will, kind of his heritage as a Jewish person, his own personal morality being, pretty good, pretty impeccable. And yet we come to this place where he says, you know what? all those things that were benefit to me, I consider them all to be rubbish for the sake of Christ. He said that I may be found in him with a righteousness that is not my own, but that comes from him. And then he says that a righteousness that comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith. And then he says that I may know him, know Jesus, the power of his resurrection, and may share in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. And so for Paul, it seems that those things are not opposed to each other. The power of Christ and sharing in his sufferings. In fact, what he says very clearly in chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians is that it is actually oftentimes in his weakness, in his suffering, when he comes to the end of himself, that's when he experiences the power of the resurrection to sustain him, to enable him, etc. And I think that as Christians, we uniquely have a view on suffering that is, I think this, but I think it's the best explanation and view on it of anyone in the world. I don't think anyone else can give as good of an explanation. And, if you survey the different explanations of how to think about suffering, they're just they're terrible, honestly. Like some people say, well, it's just fatalism, bad things happen and just deal with it. Christianity doesn't say that. It says that God actually grieves over these things, and yet, as our friend Johnny Erickson Tata said, sometimes God allows what he hates in order to accomplish what he loves. And I think that that's our view of suffering as well. And you could look at Eastern ones that say that you just kind of need to transcend human suffering, transcend the physical world. It's not that important. And actually it's like the Matrix doesn't really exist. The Bible says, no, it matters. God's suffering matters. God weeps over our suffering. He takes it personally when people suffer. And yet he is able to use suffering and redeem it in order to accomplish his purposes, both in us and through us. And I just think it's clearly something that even people back then didn't understand, right? Sometimes you talk about different approaches to Christianity that have a weird vibe to them. And one of the weird vibes, and I realize that's very subjective, but let's just live with it for a second, is this idea of triumphalism, right? And so there are different forms of triumphalism. Right? So you can have a success-oriented triumphalism where Jesus is essentially your guru who teaches you how to have a better life. There's a health and wealth kind of triumphalism, which says that, if you're doing all the things right, then you will be guaranteed to be healthy and wealthy in your life. And Paul would look at those things and say, well, do you remember that we follow a man who was stripped of everything and nailed to a cross in the ultimate act of humiliation, defeat, and loss. And yet that was the greatest moment of triumph. That was the thing through which God did his greatest work. And the message of the gospel is not you're good enough, you're strong enough, and you can do it. But it is you are weak, you are fallen, and yet there's a God who loves you and has come alongside you with his strength in order to save you. I mean, there's two opposite things. And that's why Paul says that the triumphalist gospel that was being preached by the Corinthian, would-be leaders is not even a gospel at all. It's not good news. It's not true. And it's not the gospel. And so I think this chapter and this whole idea of suffering is something that is uniquely Christian, but I would say it is the true way to view this, and the only way that is actually satisfying.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Paul seems to, he's almost bringing back what was an Old Testament view of suffering and lament. And, of the Psalms, almost a third of the Israeli, the Hebrew hymnody is dedicated to pain. Dedicated, and you say, well, you question, well, why would that be? And it's, as Paul points out, it's in that suffering where we come to know the Lord. It's in that suffering where we come to know God's true nature, as we live in that kind of paradox between the pain of this life and this fallen world and the promise of his deliverance and goodness that awaits us. And it's an interesting thing to think about, because Paul almost in his letter has elevated suffering to a place of almost that's kind of, I mean, you don't want to be a sadist in a sense, but that if you're in that Paul's like saying that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's not necessarily our goal is to find our way out of the suffering, but our goal is to walk with the Lord in the suffering. And Paul himself, of course, we did in our study, he prayed. He said, I prayed to the Lord 3 times for that thorn that was in my side. It's not like we were resigned to suffering. That's not the goal either. But that within that, God's given us that, as you said, crying out to the Lord. And even you said, Joni Eareckson Tada said, well, of course I pray for healing and all those things. But most of all, I pray that God will be glorified through what I've gone through. And that seems to be what Paul is echoing as well, right?
Yeah. And, I think that what makes this uniquely Christian, and I would say even as we look back on the Jewish origin of the Psalms, I think that even the Judaism is incomplete without what we call the eschatological hope, right? Which is, we've been doing this class at the church on eschatology, and what I explained to them is that all of Christianity is eschatological in the sense that it all points forward to this final event. In other words, history is not cyclical. It is rather linear. It's going from somewhere, and it has a final destination. And that's why the psalmist can say, in the Psalms of Lament, right, he says, how long, O Lord? And that phrase is like one that really sums up so much of the eschatological hope that we have. How long, O Lord? Like, how long is this going to go on? When are you going to intervene? Because we know that at some point, this suffering will come to an end. And like it says in Romans 8, right, like we groan as we wait for that day. But I think that even those Psalms, the reason that they're able to be so honest about their lament is partly because, as they say, how long, O Lord, there's an implication in there that there's coming a time when God is going to bring an end to the suffering, and he's going to redeem it. He's going to, bring us into this culmination of what everything's been building up to. And so I think that is the hope that we have as Christians. And I think that allows us to say, to weep and to say, how long, O Lord? And yet, as Paul says to the Thessalonians, we mourn, but we don't mourn as those who have no hope. We mourn differently than the world.
Yeah, and that's the difference, right? Is that we're all basically suffering. Is it Ecclesiastes where the sun shines on the godly and the ungodly? Meaning we all live together, as humanity in this fallen world. But there are those that live and day by day with a hope and a joy that is in Christ, and then those that don't. And that's the call. That's what Paul is calling us to. Is that what is your hope in? And that this one day this is going to end, and then what? Yeah.
So in that case, suffering is meaningless. And actually, the old phrase that we used to say, life sucks, then you die, right?
Right.
I mean, that's kind of how it is. And then every now and then you have a few good days in between. And you can understand how incredibly hopeless that message is. And if that's the best we can give people is, hey, maybe you'll have a few good days while you bide your time until nothing or worse, there's no hope in that at all. Yeah. I don't even know how you could live with something like that.
Yeah. No, the hope is definitely in the gospel. And Paul he just kind of brings that all together for us in this letter, just kind of letting the Corinthians know, hey guys, you got it all wrong. It's not about all of these other peripheral issues these super apostles are about, but it's walking with Christ, with Jesus in the midst of wherever you are. And I thought it just going through the letter just kind of sums up Paul's heart for his church. And I hope the Corinthians saw that, just how much their spiritual father really loved the church. And I was just also thinking, we were just talking briefly a little bit about the thorns in the flesh, and maybe, we delve into speculation here. But, there's some that, of course, thought that it was his eyesight. That I have also heard that there's it was the guilt that Paul felt, he was a witness at Stephen's stoning back in Acts, and he vigorously persecuted. I mean, as much as he preached the gospel and all that he went through right now, we saw that he did that against Christians, and some have said that his thorn in the side was this guilt and stuff. And so, I just thought, well, what do you think that thorn is? That Paul was dealing with.
There's a few views on it. One view, as you mentioned, different variations on what you mentioned. That essentially it's the devil, kind of. It's like a spiritual torment, if you will, whether that's torment over his past sins, whether it's torment just in general. Those are kind of the two main views, right? There's a spiritual torment, or that it is some kind of physical affliction. Those who lean on the physical affliction side would say then it becomes a lens through which you read a lot of the book of Acts and some of his letters, right? So Paul mentions in Galatians, he says, look at what big letters I write you with. Well, maybe he just wrote big letters to say, hey, check out how big my letters are. Or maybe he had trouble seeing. And that's why he wrote with big letters. Another one is that he mentions to Galatians, he says, when I was with you, you would have even given me your own eyes. Now, maybe that's a euphemism. Like you say, you would have given me the shirt off your back. You would have given me your eyes. Seems like a weird euphemism. I don't think that that's like a real thing that people said to each other back then. Seems that he had something with his eyes. And there was a form of like malaria, kind of a tropical disease that was common near the southern part of Turkey, which is more, tropical Mediterranean climate. And so they would say at that time that this disease had the effect of causing your eyes to swell and to, cause you to have headaches and things like that, which would somehow align with perhaps what Paul's talking about being a thorn in his flesh. Could have been something completely different. But then they also read into that, say, okay, well, perhaps then after having left Galatia and wanting to move into the regions, if you remember, this is how Paul ends up in Macedonia. He revisits the region of Galatia on his second missionary journey. And this is like Acts 17, right? Or 16. Yeah, I think it's 16. So he goes in chapter 16, he did his first missionary journey during which he went to the region of Galatia. Then he goes back to Antioch. They kind of regroup. Barnabas doesn't come with him this time. This time he's got Silas with him. He goes on his second missionary journey. They go back, visit some of the churches that they started on the first missionary journey. And then it says he wanted to go into the region of Bithynia and Mysia, but he was not allowed. It says that God forbade him from going. The Spirit did not allow him to go. And that's how he ends up kind of like, well, I don't know where I'm going next. And then he has a vision in the middle of the night, a man calling him from Macedonia. So some people postulate that maybe the reason he couldn't go into those places was not just like the Spirit telling him no in an abstract way, but in a much more like physical way, just being like, no, you can't because you're sick or you have this problem. So those are all things. It's a lot of speculation. There's no way to really know. I do know this, that some people are inclined to not want to believe that Paul was physically sick and that he prayed and wasn't healed. Now that comes from their hermeneutic, which says, it's actually a triumphalist hermeneutic, right? So people who hold these views that say, hey, if you are sick or, and you pray to be healed and you're not healed, it must be because there's something wrong with you. You didn't pray well enough. You didn't have enough faith, or you have some sin in your life. And so they have to make sense of this. Well, how can the Apostle Paul have prayed 3 times for a physical infirmity to have been removed and God said no? Well, they say, well, then it must not have been physical. So I'm inclined to say it's physical just because it uses the word flesh. I mean, why not? Yeah. Why choose that word specifically? So
yeah. No, I think that's some very valid points. I think that's a kind of a question that people they always want to know about that little detail. What is the thorn in the flesh? But I think, I would probably side with you as well. That it was certainly a physical thing that Paul prayed for, and it was hindering his work, but in a sense, in his weakness, he had Timothy alongside. He eventually called Mark again, and so that when you read into those things, well, they came and they comforted me. When we were at the end of 1 Corinthians, when those 3 men came, you can read more into that, where Paul certainly was comforted in the fact that these guys came around him, maybe in his affliction, and really helped him out. So that certainly makes a lot of sense. And so, that's just some great things there. This is kind of the chapter 12 here is the kind of the pinnacle of the whole letter as we dive into that phrase, strength in weakness. And well, what if God told you what was going to happen to you in the next 20 years? Think on that as you are thinking on this and getting ready to download this and send it to a friend someplace. So, grateful to have you with us this week, and we subscribe, all that fun stuff, and we'll look forward to you next week. God bless.